This is The Camp with Zach Heilprin and the Athletics' Jesse Temple.
Yes, welcome in. Spring ball is done. Badgers now on vacation for a few weeks after they get done with finals. Some of them already done with finals. CJ Williams said he was on the next thing out of town on Friday to go back home because his finals were all done. But yeah, the Badgers 15 practices in the books. They finished it off with a bit of a mix of some move the ball and some special teams work on Thursday morning. Do we want to break down at all? I don't know how that special teams thing is scored whatsoever. They did it last year. It's just a bunch of punting, bunch of kickoff, bunch of field goal. I just don't know how it's scored, but I do know that the team that was wearing red won.
I don't think it's worth breaking it down if we ourselves cannot break down to the listeners what the hell we saw. Out of spring last year, the big question from that kick scrimmage was, they need a punter, and they went and found Atticus Bertram's out of the portal. They don't appear to have that same problem this spring, but at the very least, we got to see who's working with the number one punt return group, who's with the number twos, and who could be the kick return guys. But beyond that, it's mostly a form of entertainment and curiosity because I have no idea how they scored that thing.
Yeah. So do we want to break that down real quick? It's Vinny Anthony who did the punt returns after Chimere Dike got hurt last year. It looks like he's that number one guy. Tretch Kekahuna is also involved there. I think CJ Williams could be as well. Who are some? Oh, Kyan Barry Johnson as well. There were some. I feel like if Vinny Anthony stays healthy, he'll be that guy. But at kick return, it's a little bit different, right? I mean, I think Tyrell Henry was the number one kick returner there on Thursday, and that was a Vinny Anthony thing last year.
Yeah, they didn't do a lot of kickoffs. Most of it was punting and jockeying for field position and field goals. But the first kickoff of that scrimmage had Tyrell Henry back there, and I'm not shocked by it. I thought he would compete for both roles because at Michigan State, he was their number one punt returner and kick returner. And I also think, hey, if Vinny Anthony is going to be one of your starting outside wide receivers, which is what wide receivers coach Kenny Guyton said if the season began today, he's elevated ahead to earn that spot. Not impossible, but you're asking a lot of a guy to start at wide receiver and then be the starting kick returner and punt returner. We've seen it before, but if you've got someone like Tyrell Henry who has done it at a fairly high level within the Big Ten, it makes sense to use him as well.
Yeah, I was surprised he didn't get more opportunities punt return wise.
Yep. Me too. Me too. But they obviously must like what they have in Vinny Anthony right now.
Yeah, maybe they will as they get closer to the season in fall camp. We'll see. The other aspect of it was the field goal kicking. What did you think of Nathaniel Vakos' day? I guess I don't know that. I mean, the weather was pretty nice. It was pretty nice weather. I don't know that he probably kicked as well as he thought he should.
Yeah, I don't want to take too much from that. He struggled early. I think he missed 3 kicks out of his first 6, but then he got hot and started hitting. I mean, I'm not like concerned that he's going to be a worse kicker next season. Obviously, he had a fantastic freshman year at Ohio, a good season for Wisconsin. If anything, I'm almost most impressed by Gavin Lom, who is not someone we've seen get a bunch of opportunities, especially in games as a field goal kicker. His leg is ridiculous. He closed the spring, the end of the kick scrimmage and the end of the 15th practice by burying a 50-yard field goal, and everyone on his side went crazy, and he had room to spare, and a lot of his kicks have room to spare. So Lom is someone who certainly impressed me from the kick scrimmage standpoint, though I can't say that it's going to be enough to supplant Vakos, who's been a 2-year starter at 2 different schools.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably unlikely, but the ball, I know I know we shouldn't do this because we did this with Vito Calvaruso, so I'm not going to do that again. But the ball does jump off his foot, and that's kind of why they had him as the kickoff guy for large stretches at different times. He also had, I mean, he didn't have the huge issues that Jack Van Dyke did in putting the ball out of bounds last year, but he had one out as well, and I think that did not lead to a lot more opportunities for him. You're right. It's probably not worth it to make too much out of what we saw in that 30 minutes worth of special teams work yesterday, or whatever it was, 45 minutes. But there was also some good stuff on the 11 on 11 aspect of practice. And my notes, when I went back and looked at them this morning before we started this, I thought some wide receivers really jumped out. I
Yep.
thought that there was Tyrell Henry, big time flash, and CJ Williams had a really, really nice catch and run where he was out right. He literally outran some guys to the sideline. And then Quincy Burrows probably had the play of the day. He won a jump ball, 40-yard touchdown. If you look at UW's social media, you can see it. It jumped over Braden Moore, jumped over Amari Snowden. I should say, ripped the ball away from Amari Snowden in the end zone for the score. And it just kind of put a exclamation point on what was a pretty darn good spring, I thought, for the wide receivers in general, but Quincy Burrows especially.
I think Burrows is going to be a factor in this wide receiver rotation. Now, he ended up playing more snaps later last season, but caught 4 passes for 30 yards. And he was really consistent this spring, and he has shown some big playability. That throw, I think it was a 34-yard touchdown. I had him marked at the 34, though sometimes in those practice sessions it can be hard to tell. And it was a great throw by Braden Locke. He deserves credit as well. I know we'll get into the quarterbacks, but I think Braden made some really good throws and multiple wide receivers making plays. I don't everything we've said this spring and this offseason has been tempered by what happened last year. And so I don't want to sit here and say, wow, this wide receiver group is going to be all Big Ten caliber and one of the toughest to stop. But at the very least, it does feel like they've made positive strides forward. I think a lot of that has to do with basically everyone who's playing outside of Tyrell Henry was on this team last year, got to understand the offense, understand what Phil Longo is asking of his wide receivers. And I do think there's been some positive vibes with Kenny Guyton coming on board and just what he's provided. It's something that Luke Fickell mentioned specifically when he was asked about Quincy Burrows. Quincy's got more confidence, and Kenny Guyton has helped to give him that as well. So, but he wasn't the only one. You're right. I mean, Will Pauling, I feel like we just didn't talk about him that much this spring because everybody knows what he provides, but he had some good moments. Vinny Anthony had a great catch coming back for the ball. Wisconsin had the ball going down into the end zone at the 13-yard line, and Jonas Duclona played great coverage. The ball got tipped into the air, and Vinny managed to catch it anyway inside the 5 on the left side of the field. And so they got some playmakers there. It's just hard to know exactly how that's going to translate next season.
It does, because we saw a lot of the same things last year, but I do
Right.
think that it wasn't the same as last year. I'll say that. I thought that there was a lot more like really impressive catches and not just running by guys that were going to be in the portal the next day. So,
Yes.
right. I certainly think that is noteworthy, but I wanted to do a couple of biggest, right? So biggest storyline coming out of spring ball. I don't think it can be anything other than the quarterback competition, which remains a competition, even though at times over the last 5 practices, it appeared Tyler Van Dyke had taken a little bit of a lead in that, but then Braden Locke had it, finished strong. Both, I wasn't able to go on Tuesday. You can tell me otherwise, but certainly on Thursday, I thought he was pretty darn good.
Tuesday was probably one of the least interesting practices just because it was
Okay.
short and it was coming off the big Saturday scrimmage. But for the most part, yeah, I mean, that's probably the top storyline largely because it's the quarterbacks. Quarterbacks are the sexy position. It's the one that you want to focus on. And we don't get a legitimate quarterback competition every year. And Luke Fickell has said on multiple occasions, he's used that word legitimate competition, which he said after practice on Thursday. Again, they really are giving both guys every opportunity to try and earn the job all the way through the spring. Both guys earned reps with the 1s and 2s. I feel like Tyler did some really good things, especially towards the second half of the spring, that showed why they went and got him. And if I had to say the first game is tomorrow, I would say it's going to be Van Dyke, but I'm not making that decision. And I think it's a good thing that Locke has pushed him as much as he has. I do think there's some things that Van Dyke brings that can add a different element, specifically in the run game. Even if he isn't Tanner Mordecai fast, he could do some really good things there. I just felt he looked so much more comfortable towards the second half. And to me, I know 2 Saturdays ago, he talked about how he had made really good strides. And then I thought in the spring scrimmage, he was excellent. I mean, he led 3 touchdown drives, and these are my unofficial notes, but I had him completing all 11 passes on those series for more than 135 yards. And all that goes to the comfort level that he has. And it's only going to grow the more practice opportunities he gets.
There is no doubt that he improved as spring went on, and that's what you're expecting as a guy gets more comfortable with the offense. I always go back to what Luke Fickell was talking about in terms of catastrophic plays,
Mm-hmm.
right? And earlier in the spring, there were certainly quite a few. I remember sitting up there in the McLean Center when we were watching practice and being like, this doesn't look anything better than last year. This is not going to be great. And then over the last 5 practices, there were very few catastrophic mistakes from Tyler Van Dyke. And I think that, as much as anything, is important when it comes down to who's going to win this job. But I don't know. I guess I don't know that Braden Locke had a ton of them either.
No.
But you're right. I do think the arm of Tyler Van Dyke is kind of what makes it a little bit different. For me, it does. Not that Braden Locke doesn't have the arm to get it done, but when you put the entire package together, I don't know that they're outside of maybe knowing the offense, knowing exactly where the ball needs to go on a regular basis. I don't know that what Braden Locke has over Tyler Van Dyke.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. It's a good issue that Wisconsin has, and going into the fall, I'm sure the first week or so will look fairly similar to what spring practice was, just because you're not going to go in based on what you saw this spring and definitively say this guy's number one. Phil Longo talked about that after the Saturday scrimmage. He felt like he had two competent quarterbacks and everything was far from finished. But I think that's a really good way that you put it. That the total package, I think, is what would give Van Dyke an edge. But these guys will continue to push each other through the first couple of weeks of fall camp in August.
They will. That is, again, as I think it's the biggest storyline. You could tell me otherwise if you think there's something else that really jumps out and says, no, this is what I'm paying attention to.
Well, there's a lot of storylines. I
Yes.
think one notable one to me is simply offensive line play. This is Wisconsin after all, and it should be a storyline every spring. Now, the big storyline throughout the spring was the general lack of experience beyond that top group. But I do wonder how much better as a whole the top group that you're actually going to see out there on Saturdays will be next season, because much like every other position group, probably wasn't what you wanted to see last season. And I know they showed a lot of improvement, and they talked about how they felt like they did pretty well as pass blockers, but wanted to improve significantly in run blocking. I think we saw a lot of improvement in there. There were a lot of big runs from the running backs. 4 of those 5 guys have starting experience, a ton of experience. And then Joe Brunner, to me, I mean, yeah, he's only played 45 career snaps and only got in for 7 snaps last season. He should have played more last season. And AJ Blazek said as much, even though he wasn't here. The guy looks like he's been a 2-year starter already. I think there is reason for optimism with that top group, even though I know we talked a ton about sacks from guys coming off the edge. I do think that's a pretty quality top 5. You just wonder what happens if somebody gets hurt or more than one guy gets hurt.
Again, I don't know that they're what they would potentially want to continue to add from the portal.
I don't think there's much left there other than a defensive lineman.
That's what I'm saying. Like, I don't know that there's going to, like, the group that they have is kind of the group that they have at offensive line at this point, right? Would you
I
say
would
that,
think so, because
would
they
you say
already
that?
went and got because they already went and got Leighton Nelson from the portal, who didn't have a ton of experience but had familiarity with Blazek. So like that's 14 scholarship offensive linemen as you're projecting ahead to next season.
And then you also have Barrett Nelson coming back from injury at some
Right.
point, you would think. So that is someone that was missing this spring. And then Joey Okla as well, who I know he's not a scholarship guy, but a guy who has been in college for a few years or a couple years, and has at least the body and the idea of knowing what college football in the Big Ten is, even though he didn't play at Illinois. So I think there's a lot of optimism with the front line group, and that they're going to be able to find enough bodies behind them to, if there are injuries, to fill in. I mean, I think certainly JP Benchall is a guy that's going to be able to play left or right guard for you. Joe Heber can play center if Jake Renfro were to go down. We saw Joe Brunner at left tackle when Jack Nelson went down, so maybe he's your starting left tackle as well if Jack were to go down, and then you can move JP into the starting lineup. Huber can also play right tackle, so they have some options among that top 6. It's, can they find other guys that they're comfortable enough playing with? And this spring has just been, I think, amazing for a guy like Colin Culberly or obviously Kevin Haywood, and the time and snaps and reps that they got is just so abnormal for a true freshman coming in along the offensive line in January. So, or yeah, when they came in January. So it's just we'll see. We'll see. They've got more time to get them ready, but very very rarely do you have this many reps under your belt as a true freshman along the offensive line those two guys got being part of the second team offense for most of most of the spring. So yeah, it's an interesting position, and I know that there's probably a lot more other storylines out there, and I would assume you are going to do an article at some point on the storylines coming out of spring.
Yeah, I'm sure that's coming at some point,
Okay,
something
all right,
along those lines.
I assumed. Best player in the spring for you. I know you did
Mm.
your, I know you did your biggest stock up guys, right? Coming out of spring. That's up on the Athletic right now. A number of names there that I would definitely agree with and could go with for this, but which one would you say?
Wow.
Mm,
Best player is really hard because it's easy to just go with somebody who was a starter last year. I mean, it's hard not to think about the guys who really like popped. I mean, I just Tawee Walker comes to mind just because I hadn't seen him before. That doesn't mean he's better than Chez Malusi. Um, but to me, he was one of the most impressive players this spring. And maybe that comes in part because of where my expectation level was for him. Like Tretch Kahuna, we all felt like this was going to be a big spring for him. He had a breakout game in the bowl game, and he continued that forward this spring. And I just didn't know why are they getting Walker? Now they have 8 scholarship running backs for next season. They have 3 freshmen coming in. 2 of those guys are 4 stars. Is he just an insurance policy in case Malusi gets hurt? Can he be something more? And I was just so impressed with the touches that he got, the way that he was able to push the pile forward, the burst that he has. I don't know what the numbers are going to look like, but I feel like they have found a really good potential 1-2 running back combination. And certainly Dylan Jones and Darian Dupree hope to have something to say about that. So I don't know if that means he's the best player, and maybe it's easier to separate between offense and defense because I would just pick insert outside linebacker on the defense because they were so. I mean, John Pius, Daryl Peterson, and Leon Lowry were so disruptive this spring.
Yeah, I'm not going to take issue with any of that. I know when you're looking at your stock up guys, a lot of them are guys that did not play any roles last year, right?
Right. Right.
Whether here or otherwhere, or whether here or other places. Obviously, one of those guys that did play a role last year, especially late, was Nizer Forkerine,
Yes.
who Luke Fickell mentioned a number of times the most improved player from last year. So it's kind of hard not to look at him. Uh, it's also difficult not to go with the offensive guys because they just get so many opportunities that they're going to make plays eventually. And that was certainly the case with a guy like Quincy Burrows and Tretch Kahuna. So I think it's a tough question. It's a tough question to say this guy was the best throughout the entirety of spring, but the guy that it felt like consistently made the plays was Tretch.
Sure.
And if I'm looking over the entirety of spring, if I'm looking at the 15 practices of which 13 I got to see, I feel like that was him for me, for me. But that's also a little bit of, it's also a little bit of my bias here, Jesse, too. I'm going to be completely honest with you. I
Well,
just, I just looked at him a lot and watched him a lot and made note of every time that he did make a play. So that's also part of it for me, at least. I know you are a much more down the middle reporter and have, you don't get favorites in your head.
I do. I'm a
Unless their
human,
name
but
is
I
Tommy,
think
unless their name is Tommy McIntosh or Vito Calvaruso.
oh, the shade, the shade. I think the question of best is a really hard one to answer. Like to me, no doubt about it, most electrifying player this spring is Tretch. But is he better than Will Pauling? No, I can't say that. So does that make him best? But in terms of guys who turned heads, that's why he's on my list. And one of the things I wrote was that there were occasions this spring when he was on the field, I found myself thinking, just get the ball to him in space so we can see what happens, because all he needs is a little sliver. I mean, he made to me, since we're recapping the entire spring, what I thought was maybe the best play of the spring, which we've talked about on a couple occasions, just a simple catch into the flat and then juked 2 defensive backs with separate moves. But he did that on multiple occasions. Even in the scrimmage, there were a couple situations where he could either juke a guy or he would just completely spin away from them. They have him in his grasp and they cannot stop him. It's a great combination of skills. I'm certainly interested to see how Longo decides to use both him and Will Pauling on the field together. I don't know if that means best, but most
Yeah.
electrifying without a doubt.
Well, there you go. Superlatives is what we should have been doing here instead of best, but that's fine. Biggest surprise of spring for you?
Hmm. I will go Max Lofi.
Okay.
I'm sure there's probably a bigger picture one, but since I didn't
No, I think no, I
prepare in
mean
advance,
I think that's worthwhile.
I think the fact that this is a guy who just didn't play last year could have easily been forgotten about. You had Austin Brown coming back with the job that he did in the bowl game, and I mean, I thought RJ Delancey III was going to fill that role, but cornerbacks coach Paul Haynes even said in his media availability that they always viewed him as a guy on the outside. And he's another name that I would throw out there as someone who I think came on strong in the spring, certainly got more opportunities in the second half to work with the first team over Jonas Duclona, and then Delancey got hurt the last couple of practices, so Duclona moved back up there. But I think back to what Mike Tressel said after the Saturday scrimmage about the fact that he knew, in his word, zero about Lofi before spring practices began because he was dealing with an ankle injury last year. And now this is a guy who legitimately could be your starting slot corner. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily going to happen because if Kamoi Latu is healthy, you figure it would be Latu and Wohler with Brown in the slot, but obviously it gives Wisconsin more options. And I think that's it may not be the biggest storyline, but that's a notable storyline to me based on my expectation going into the spring and where we're at coming out of it.
I think the biggest surprise was that there was a quarterback competition to begin with
Yeah, that's
because
fair too.
we watched last year Tanner Mordecai come in and take virtually every single team one rep there. And Braden Locke was essentially the number two throughout. It wasn't even close. And this year they split reps almost, I don't want to say evenly because didn't chart the exact number of reps each one got, but the fact that there was even a quarterback competition was a surprise for me. And now coming out of spring, the surprise is not. I mean, that's not a surprise now after watching the entirety of spring. But going into it, no one. I don't know that there was anybody that was expecting an actual quarterback competition. Not to say that Braden Locke wasn't going to get snaps with the first team, but it was pretty right down the middle for them throughout the entire spring. So, yes, that one stands out for me. And Max Lofi's a good one as well. I think I know you already talked about Tyree Walker, but Tyree Walker was a big surprise for
Yeah.
me. Like I didn't realize the explosion that he had. I didn't realize the type of ability to catch the ball that he had. There were just because there's not. I mean, he got opportunities at Oklahoma, but there's not a ton of flash plays, and he made a ton of flash plays during the spring. So I don't know exactly what that looks like this fall because they are bringing in a couple of talented kids and Dylan Jones and Darian Dupree, but I think he's earned himself a role, and we'll just see how significant it's going to be. But I imagine it to be pretty significant at this point.
Yeah,
At
I
this
think
point,
I think it would take a lot for either Dupree or Jones in a span of 4 weeks to supplant what Walker did this spring and
yeah,
presumably what he'll continue to do in the fall. And also it's a veteran guy. You just can't replicate the experience that somebody has, even if he wasn't the number one guy at Oklahoma. He still had some really good games, 100+ yard games last season for the Sooners. And just like everything that he did this spring, I think your point about the quarterbacks is a good one. And looking back now, that probably would be one of the biggest surprises, just because the automatic assumption was, oh, you went and got Van Dyke from Miami, who's a multi-year starter, started 28 games there. And here's Braden Locke, who started 3 games because Mordecai got hurt. It's just going to look like it did last year. But I think it speaks to a couple different things, one of which is probably the progress that Locke has made, and just maybe the amount of work that Van Dyke needed to do to prove himself. And again, nothing is fully decided at this stage, but that's a good one.
yeah. I also say about those young guys, the one guy that Tyree Walker reminded me of, and as we got further into spring, I got further away from the comparison just because of how explosive he was. But Chris James had a fantastic when he another transfer from Pittsburgh had a fantastic spring. Was like made just an insane move on Garrett Rand, like just that left him on the ground. This was spring of 2017, and then you get to the fall of 2017, and you're like, well, he's going to be your starting running back, obviously. Him and Bradrick Shaw, what they're going to be the two, and then all of a sudden, Taiwan Deal gets hurt, and a guy named Jonathan Taylor gets an opportunity, and we know what happened after that. So I'm not saying that Dylan Jones or Darian Dupree are that guy in Jonathan Taylor. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that what happens in the spring doesn't always lead to what we expect in the fall. So
That is correct.
I think, is that fair or no?
Oh, 100%.
Okay. What is your biggest question coming out of spring?
I suppose impactfulness of the defensive line. Just because most of the time we saw a lot of the plays, it was come from the outside linebackers. And we talked about this before. James Thompson had a good season last year, and then you've got a bunch of guys who, at least from a statistical standpoint, were not extraordinarily impactful. I think they've got something with that combination of Thompson and Neal, who have very different body types. Now, Ben Barton has been the third guy if they have three on the field, and it seems like Cade McDonald is your fourth. But can you get more out of that group? And that may be in part why they've been looking for someone to add out of the transfer portal. Obviously, they did lose TJ Bowlers earlier this spring. So that's one question that I would have coming out of the spring.
It's a good one for sure. I think that we kind of already mentioned this, but the depth at the offensive line spots are
Yep.
a big concern, or not a concern, a question coming out of spring. I also would look at exactly how things are going to break down at tight end as a question coming out of spring, because Jackson McGowan is one of those guys that you mentioned as stock up, and I would agree with that. How does he, along with Riley Nowakowski and not JT Seagreaves, excuse me, even though he may play as well, but Tucker Ashcraft, like what does that group look like? And when I was talking to Tretch, he he was talking about a lot of 10 personnel and him and um Will Pauling and two other receivers and then having the one back. He's like, "Well, we could see that a lot more." And I think that's something we mentioned earlier in the spring, and then the tight ends all of a sudden started playing really well. I'm not saying they're not going to have a role in here, but I just don't know what exactly it looks like. So that's a question for me. And I also very interested to see how they're going to handle all those inside linebackers, because we think Jake Chaney feels like a starter. But after that, Christian Allegro, I know he's on your list, but Jaheim Thomas, Taka Curtis was back taking part yesterday. I don't know if you saw that, like on the big run by Jackson Aker when he was with the second team. I think it was Kevin Haywood pulled and really blew up Taka Curtis as Jackson Aker ran through a massive hole. But he was back. Where does he fit? Like there are in Tyler Janzi and Sebastian Cheeks. Like who is and how many guys can they actually play on the inside? And will it end up being the guys we thought it was going to be? Is it going to end up being Jake Chaney along with Jaheim Thomas or Taka Curtis or Christian Allegro? I think that's another question for me. And then you mentioned Kamoi Latu and the safety spot. I feel like Austin Brown's a better safety than he is a slot, especially if you like Max Lofi enough that you want that he's even a better option than Austin Brown at the slot. And based on what I saw in spring, kind of looks it. Now he hasn't done it. I know he played in 22 and a lot of snaps in 22, but what does it look like in this particular defense? If he looks like he did in the spring, you're going to keep him off the field. That one's tough for me, even though Kamoi Latu came on at the end of last year after a really, really tough start to the year. We'll see. I don't know that it's for me. I don't know that it's written in stone that Kamoi Latu is going to be a starter.
Yeah, those are good ones. I maybe throw in just what does this wide receiver rotation end up looking like? This may be the storyline every year in this offense. Oh, we'd like to play six guys, or we have six guys that are capable. And honestly, I do believe, based on what we saw, there are seven guys who are capable of actually contributing. But let's be real, that's just not going to happen next season unless you're taking away snaps from some of your starting group. Obviously, we know Bryson Green and Will Pauling are two of the guys. Vinny Anthony certainly appears to have earned that other outside wide receiver spot, but CJ Williams got a ton of opportunities with the first team group, had some good moments. Maybe didn't wow as much as he did last year, but it also didn't come against third string guys who, like you said, were going to be in the portal the next week. And we've talked about Quincy Burrows and Tretch Kekahuna. And then there's also Tyrell Henry, who earned a fair share of opportunities with the top two offensive groups and is a guy who was pretty productive at Michigan State last year when you consider that oftentimes people who are transferring just didn't do anything. I mean, think about all the guys this spring that left Wisconsin, guys who were not going to be a part of the rotation, really hadn't gotten much statistically. So there's a lot to like there, but I don't know. And this is what Kenny Guyton said as part of his challenge is coming up with a strategic plan of how you're going to use all these guys. Which of those players are going to emerge and what do those numbers look like beyond Will Pauling and the numbers he had last year and Bryson Green and what you think he can do?
And it's also a guy that we did not get to see at all this spring in anything other than a yellow jersey, but had a really nice start to spring last year, and that's Chris Brooks Jr. Could he fit in at some point? Hakon Anderson was a guy that Kenny Guyton mentioned. I don't know that there's going to be reps for him, but he's a guy that does everything right and he's a leader. So he's got a good problem. It's just, can you keep everyone happy? And that's, I guess, his job. But I think they have three slots that can play, and they even used C.J. Williams in the slot. They can use Vinny Anthony in a slot, but I think all three, Will Pauling, Tresca Kahuna, and Kyan Barry Johnson, could all play this year if they needed them to. Like, and I guess I'm really talking about Kyan Barry Johnson at this point. As soon as he figured some of the college aspect of things out, he started to flash in the practices. So they have made over this wide receiver room. I mean, who's left from before? Vinny Anthony? That's essentially
Chris
it,
Brooks
right?
Jr., technically.
And Chris Brooks
right?
Jr. Yeah.
I think that's it.
That's it. Outside of, like, in terms of scholarship guys, that's it. So
Pretty
they've made
wild.
over they've made over this room significantly. And we'll see exactly what it could potentially look like. I know you're going to be putting out your depth chart, and when I was going through it last night, it's a little bit difficult because some of the guys that were out in spring, like a Barrett Nelson, that type of stuff. But I'm interested to see what yours looks like when you release that. It's going to be coming next week, I assume, right? At some point,
Yeah,
maybe.
got the offensive depth chart already in the can, running Monday,
Uh,
and we'll
okay.
do defensive and special teams, which I have yet to go through.
Okay. All right. All right. The defensive one was actually a little bit easier for me, even though I
Was
think
it?
just at certain spots, because defensive line, I only went with two defensive linemen.
Okay, yeah,
Are
that's
you
fair.
going to go like this?
I,
Are you going to
I
go like the real 3-4 or
no,
the
I would probably go with the two where I mean, we talked about it. Like, it's going to be James Thompson Jr. and Kurt Neal, and if
right?
you need a Barton, but they're going to have five DBs on the field. I mean, geez, they might have five linebackers on the field. So, the D lineman reps will probably not be as substantial as some of these other spots.
Yeah, for sure. I went with Lofi as my starting slot. I don't know what you're going to do.
Okay,
That's gonna
giving
be a
away
tough
state
one.
secrets.
That's going to be a tough one. That's one I'm
Mhm.
going with it. I'm going with it. And
Okay.
Austin Brown at safety and Kamali Law. I think like a lot of the safeties are all going to play at different times. Like Preston Zachman's a guy that we also saw a bunch last year that didn't take part in spring at all because of injury. Where does he fit in? There are like those are the tougher things I think with a depth chart at this point than anything. But Wisconsin is done with spring ball. They will get a few weeks off here, and then they'll start their summer workouts. However, early Friday morning, Jesse, they hauled in another recruit in the class of 2025. They brought in Luke Emmerich from the fantastic state of Minnesota, three-star athlete. I know that some people are calling him a safety, but he is an athlete, and Wisconsin gets him on board. Now he has 15 offers. He's gotten a lot of offers of late. Among those offers from PJ Fleck and his hometown Gophers, but he chose Wisconsin instead.
Yeah, I mean, they've gotten a couple of guys recently. We didn't talk necessarily about Grant Dean, who's a safety from Neenah, Wisconsin, and then they got Cam Clark, an offensive tackle out of Michigan. So this 2025 class is coming together pretty nicely. They've got 10 commits so far. It's a top 20 class at this point, although obviously that can change the later you get into it. But always good to get somebody out of Minnesota who got the Gophers offer. And it did kind of seem like he was starting to blow up with Ohio State coming through. And I mean, this came together really quick because he was only up there fairly recently, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I'm wondering exactly where they would end up seeing him. I know I haven't had a chance to talk to him, but like where they envision him being, because while he is listed as a safety on some of the recruiting sites, kind of view him more as an athlete than anything. So I guess curious as to where they kind of foresee him playing once it gets to Madison. But I'm not going to call this a weird one, but the way it came out was a little bit weird, right?
Yeah, it just kind of popped up from somebody on a Friday morning. Usually there's the whole process that goes into it about bat signals and kid publishing some type of commitment, but everyone's different and not everybody wants that. And that's just fine. So, we'll see what happens. This is kind of like we were talking before we started recording. Coy Parrish was a guy from Minnesota who was slightly similar, I think, and Wisconsin had a really good chance at him, and Parrish ended up signing with the Gophers. So we know in recruiting, nothing is ever over until they sign. And if all these schools are coming in for him right now, they're absolutely not going to stop. So as strange it is to say, the recruitment has only just begun, despite the fact he's committed, is kind of how it feels like based on what we've seen over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and he's a kid that missed his junior season. So you would expect, especially once the camp circuit starts, that it's probably going to even jump up even more. But he did run track this spring, ran a 10.6900. So he's got some speed to him. That according to 24/7. Played quarterback, defensive back, and wide receiver as a sophomore. So I think if he plays well, yeah, those offers will keep coming in. And he got his spot at Wisconsin. We'll see exactly where he wants to be or where they want him to be. Could he grow into something more than a safety? I guess we'll see. But Wisconsin has what was he? Commit number
10.
Number 10. So into double digits for the Badgers in the class of 2025. All right. Jesse, thank you very much. We'll be back next week. We're going to keep on doing shows throughout the summer, but we'll be back next week, talk a little depth chart.